minorities, fractious religious and political groups, and extreme movements, many defined as terrorist. Russia has them all. But you could argue that Russia is a terrorist state itself. And what is terrorism anyway? Is terrorism a mere question of definition, historical or current? Join me, Darasz, for How We Got Here.
The Moscow concert hall shooting on March 22nd was the deadliest terrorist attack in Russia in 2 decades. Over the past 25 years, Russia has seen several terror attacks, mostly carried out by terrorists from Chechnya and other regions in the North Caucasus. Some of them were religiously motivated, others were perpetrated by separatists with political demands. The Kremlin has used its fight against terrorism as an excuse to consolidate power and gradually restrict political and public freedoms. In September 1999, 4 explosions destroyed apartment blocks throughout Russia. The blasts killed more than 300 people and injured more than 1,700, sparking fear in millions of people across the country. The Kremlin accused Chechen militias of carrying out the attacks. Some journalists and Russian analysts believe that the explosions were orchestrated by Russian state security. The bombing was one of the reasons behind sending troops to Chechnya, triggering the Second Chechen War. In October 2002, armed Chechen fighters occupied the crowded Dubrovka theatre in central Moscow. More than 900 spectators and performers were taken hostage. The attackers demanded the withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya. After 3 days of negotiations, Russian special forces stormed the building. All 40 terrorists were killed. 130 hostages were also killed and several hundred wounded. On September 1, 2004, the first day of the new school year in Russia, armed terrorists occupied a school in the city of Beslan, North Ossetia, taking over 1,100 hostages, including nearly 800 children. This time, Russian authorities did not negotiate. On the 3rd day of the siege, special forces entered the school building. During the operation, 31 assailants and 334 hostages, mostly children, were killed. In the 2010s, several suicide bombings were carried out across Russia, mostly by jihadists from the North Caucasus. All of these attacks have one thing in common. Putin's regime used them to stir up fear in the country and impose further measures of control over Russian society.
I'm delighted to welcome as our guest Zygmunt Dzięciołowski, the founding editor of OpenDemocracy Russia and an acknowledged Russian expert. So welcome to the programme.
Thank you for the invitation.
It's a great pleasure to have you once more. What's your take on the recent? We'll start with the up-to-date current affairs. What's your take on the recent attack? We'll call it a terrorist attack on the Moscow concert hall. How do you see it? Is it there are certain rumours flying around. Is it a false flag operation? Is it a internecine feud between Muslim groups? Is it ISIS? How do you evaluate the current situation?
I don't have access to any exclusive information, and I've been following different Russian experts for the last 2 days, and they usually agree. Like I listened yesterday to the great Russian journalist Sergei Aswanyan, former journalist of Echo of Moscow radio station, who is now in exile, and he sort of believes that it was false flag operation. Conducted under auspices of the Russian secret services, and the 4 Tajiks that could have been arrested were just victims thrown to the public,
yes,
to demonstrate that someone is responsible. But real perpetrators haven't been caught, and they were guaranteed a safe passage from the site of their attack. We don't have really reliable information which allows us to give final conclusions, and I'm afraid, as it used to be the case with different acts of terror in the last 20, 30 years in the Russian Federation, there is always some dark side of the situation.
Yes.
At the first glance, we know what it's all about, but at the same time, we have serious doubts about the course of events. Who were the perpetrators? What were their final motives? Who was the one who placed an order or who gave final instructions? Or if it wasn't something planned by the terrorists, but at the same time,
yes.
Russian secret services had information about it and for some reasons allowed this to take place. And this is something like this.
I mean the Russian security services do have form in this, don't they? There's a well-known, now well-known planting of a bomb in the apartment block prior to the Second Chechen War. Is that?
This is the sort of the classic example, yes, of this kind of situation, like Yuri Felshtinsky, Russian historian who lives now in New York, and late KGB agent Colonel Litvinenko. They wrote a book under the title "FSB Explodes Russia," but with the apartment blocks explosion of 1999, we really had a clue. The situation in the city of Ryazan, at some point, the Russian secret services appealed to the public to monitor the situation after the first apartment blocks, and the retired inhabitant of an apartment block in the city of Ryazan realized that there were some unknown guys, yes, to him carrying bags with something to the basement of the house. So he called the police. The police arrived, and they turned out that this was explosives, and they were FSB agents. It was found out, and then FSB said, "No, we just had exercises aimed at local population to find out if they're really alert to the situation or not." So that was clear.
Is this a tradition that the Russian, and previously the Soviet security services, and then the Tsarist security services, is this a tradition that they had to meddle and to have these false flag operations? For example, we see the Tsarist Okhrana in its falsification of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that kind of thing. Is that a tradition that it's had since the 19th century?
I would start with the tradition of violence. Russia used to be a very violent country. Yes. And when you read how Alexander Nevsky dealt with the people of Novgorod in the 13th century, okay, this was a different period of time, Middle Age, and people were sort of more cruel than they are now. But the sort of sophistication of his tortures are really hair-raising.
Yes.
Russia was full of violence. It was full of violence with aristocrats, with serfs, with Tsar, with his subjects. So at some point in the 19th century, especially in the 19th century, revolutionaries realized that they sort of believed that the only way to deal with oppressive regimes, Tsarist regime, is to apply violence. And they were pretty successful. In 1882, the revolutionaries of People's Will Organization, portrayed by Dostoevsky, they were, yes, able to assassinate Tsar reformer. Alexander II was the one who gave Russia a constitution and liberated serfs. But nevertheless, they believed that he is an obstacle to revolution and development, so they carried out successful assassination attempt in Petersburg.
So they had concrete political aims.
These were political groups. This is different than this Islam terror. It was a little bit different. But then you had the second wave of terrorism. This was early 20th century with the party Socialist Revolutionaries, and they were pretty active, and they had special revolutionary faction carrying out assassination attempts. They were pretty successful. At least 2 interior ministers have been killed, and the brother of Tsar has been killed, and the Russian Prime Minister Stolypin, also a reformer, was killed in an assassination attempt in Kiev. They were pretty. And it continued after the October Revolution because they made an assassination attempt against Lenin. So there is some kind of tradition of revolutionary violence, and believe that removing central figures of the oppressive state apparatus, that makes it easier for the revolutionary forces to achieve their final goal and to achieve victory.
The more chaos you engender, the more the more fertile the ground. Is there a sense in? Does it make any sense at all to label somebody as terrorist if the state, as you mentioned, Russia from the 13th century onwards, violent, a terrorist state itself? How do you?
Is
this just a question of semantics?
We really have the sort of top embodiment of Russian state as a terrorist state that was under Stalin. So Stalin sort of remembered all these terrorist acts of the late 19th, beginning of 20th century, and when he took power, then we really could see the state terror at its sort of maximum, or fictitious trials and executing people without trials, and labor camps and brutal investigations. When sometimes when you read about how in some cases how investigations were carried out by Stalin's hangmen, that's really hair-raising. That's really terrible. They had no mercy for people, and if we had more peaceful times, vegetarian times, as famous Russian poet Anna Akhmatova once said, now we have vegetarian times. It means that no mass repressions, no mass executions, no mass incarcerations, and then
not carnivorous.
Yes, some periods of times in post-war Soviet history were sort of after Stalin died, they were not without political inmates and not without political repression, but not at the scale that we got used to under Stalin. Putin's era is a little bit different. Yeltsin, post-Soviet era, I would say, is a little bit different because at first we had this Chechen war, and Chechen war resulted in some absolutely horrible acts of terror, like maybe you remember 1995. Chechen terrorists attacked the city of Budyonovsk, and they killed maybe 100 or 200 people on the streets of the city, and they barricaded themselves with hostages in the hospital. But at that time, Russian government sort of finally came to the conclusion that they can sort this out, the situation, by the way of negotiations. And there was famous phone call between Prime Minister Chernomydin and the head of terrorists, Shamil Basayev, which led to the release of hostages. What is important, the reason I mention this is because there is a connection to present day. One of the Putin's political inmates, one of the heads of the Memorial Human Rights and Historical Association, Oleg Orlov, who was recently sentenced to nearly 3 years of labor camp, was one who volunteered in 1995 that he would he was a volunteer hostage in order to release hostages taken. So he went to Budyonovsk, and they went on the buses to Chechnya, and he was this is some kind of paradox, that somebody who was willing to sacrifice himself for the release of hostages, now he is inmate.
Yes.
But then we had you mentioned this explosion of apartment buildings, but we had two really absolutely horrible cases of terror, which was occupying the theater in 2002 during the musical Nordost, and that ended up with 130 people who were killed, and something which was the largest case of terror in Europe in 2004, that was Beslan, that was occupation of the school on the first day of the, and which led to nearly 300 people killed and hundreds of injured, because Putin didn't want to negotiate, and he just decided to shoot the school building with heavy artillery.
We need to wind up our discussion. A question about the status of minorities in Russia. Russia's a great empire. It conquered parts of Central Asia, the Caucasus, Poland, of course, and there was a response by the terrorist groups, resistance groups against Russia. Is the Russian response just to apply more force, to apply more authority, to apply more military strength to deal with this simmering empire that it has?
Look,
at the moment?
At the moment, Russia is conducting a war with Ukraine. That war is this kind of semi-totalitarian state. I mean, in order to carry on, in order to go on with the war, that really needs to crack down on all opposition forces in Russia. And there is widespread belief among Russian opposition now that the result of this terror act in Crocus City Hall in the Moscow neighborhood, this will lead to more repression and crackdown on the opposition forces in Russia. It's not only crackdown on the opposition, it's crackdown on everything. You need to mobilize young men to go to the front. So you need to they are not really ready to volunteer. You need to take them to the army by force. Yes, constant brigade. And then if anybody opens up his mouth against the war, then you really have to make him to shut up. So it's widespread fear. And I'm also quite concerned among Russian opposition, those who are present in Russia and those who are in exile, that it would be a good pretext for Putin. Putin applies asymmetric response usually. After 2004 terrorism act in Beslan, what he did, he cancelled election of regional governors. I mean, he uses this kind of situation to apply asymmetric response to do something which has been on his mind, but he uses this as a pretext. So I'm not very optimistic about the final outcome of this Crocus City Hall.
Zygmunt Dzięciołowski, we have to unfortunately leave it there. So thank you very much for coming onto the programme.
Thank you.
Great to have you. And that's all we have time for today. So join us next time on How We Got Here.